teaching at a Bible Institute in Dnipropetrovsk on the banks of the mighty Dnieper River in southern Ukraine. And oddly enough, the Bible Institute held its classes in what had been, back in the days of communism, a resort. So it was a beautiful place on the banks or cliff overlooking the Dnieper River. But it, had run down with, under the communist regime, everything just kind of decayed. So, the shower was one stream of water out of the spigot way up here, and it was cold. There was no hot water at all. This was in October. Anyway, the Sunday, my first Sunday there in Ukraine to teach, I was asked to preach in a church just up the Dnieper River from Dnipropetrovsk. I don't remember the name of the town, a little small town, and it was a harvest day. They were having this big harvest. They had a big, huge dinner on the ground and such and such. So this is my first experience in Ukraine or anywhere in Eastern Europe. Since then, I've been to Russia a couple of times. I've been to Romania many times. And I've been to Bulgaria and other places in Hungary, other places in Eastern Europe. But this is my first time, and I wasn't quite prepared for this. First of all, they didn't plan the service until we all got there. I mean, they didn't plan it. I mean, I planned days ahead for our services. And when I got there, I found out there were going to be two other preachers. I was going to be one of three. But I wouldn't know where I was going to be in the pecking order until we got there. And they put the whole service together. I meet with the deacons I meet every Sunday, but we don't plan the service then. The service is all planned. Well, in that meeting, they planned the service. Well, I'm an American, and plus, I'm a type A personality, and I want things done right ahead of time. I want to know what's coming, and I want to start on time. I didn't do that today, but we have lots to talk about in the meeting. Anyway, so I was a little bit deaf, frankly. I'm an American. This is not the way you're supposed to do things. And this is a big church. I mean, we're talking 400 or 500 people. We're not talking about a little dinky rural church somewhere. But later, and I don't remember who told me this. I don't remember if it was one of the members of that church or somebody in my class. I don't remember who told me, but somebody explained to me why things were done the way they were done. And when I learned the backstory, it told me the whole story. Here's the backstory. I almost can't tell this without emotion. The reason they didn't prepare the services until they got there was because back in the days of communism, they didn't know until they showed up on Sunday whether or not they would have a preacher. You might be in jail. So they couldn't plan any service until Sunday. I was so ashamed when I heard that. Here I'm an American. I want things to be done just so, because in America I have the freedom to do exactly that. I've never lived in a regime where I didn't know until Sunday if there would be a preacher or if there would be a church service. The backstory told me the whole story. Let me suggest to you that as we begin our journey through the Bible, we begin, of course, through Genesis. Genesis is the backstory that tells the whole story. What is that story? Well, in your worship folder today, you have an insert. Now, we're not going to do this every week. This is actually quite a bit of work. So, that's not the reason I want to do it every week, but just because it won't be as essentially as it is today. But in your worship folder, I appreciate Ms. Sherry and those who worked on the bulletin getting this in there. But what I've given you here is, or are, two possible ways to outline the book of Genesis. In our journey through the Bible, I want to give you an outline every week. I want to give you a way to hang on to the content of the book. Okay, I think that's important. And I want to give it to you in a, obviously it's not a detailed outline, but just enough so that you have an idea what this book is about. Well, scholars have outlined the book of Genesis in a number of different ways. These are not the only ones. But I've just found over the years that these two ways of outlining the book of Genesis are very helpful. The first one is what I might call a chronological outline that divides the book into three parts based on the periods that they cover. So there's the primeval period up to the flood. Then there's the patriarchal period from Abraham on until Joseph and the beginning of the sojourn of Israel in Egypt. So you have the primeval period, the early ancient world. You have the patriarchal period, Abraham through Jacob up to Joseph. And then you have the Egyptian world. Okay, that's a good outline. And that's not a bad way to remember the content of Genesis. Another good outline is based on a particular word that is found 11 times in the book of Genesis. The word is pronounced toledot. I've got a note about that in there. You can read that. The word toledot itself is a plural word in Hebrew, and it means generations, but generations in the idea or in the sense of, well, this is the history of. So, since it appears 11 times, you have all 11 instances of the word there in the text. And scholars have often pointed out that this really makes for a kind of a pretty neat outline. So that you can divide the book, you can see the transitions of the book just based on that word toledot. Now, depending on your translation, it may not say generations. If you have an English Standard, it does. If you have a New American Standard, it does. Some others may not. In the New King James, for example, the word is not always translated generations, but you can read that there, and that's really all I want to say about this, because I'm not going to use either one of these outlines. They're both good. They both have their place, and I hope this is helpful. But in my mind, there is a better way to remember the book of Genesis. The backstory that tells the story of the Bible. By the way, let me just stop right there and put a little bracket to say, you should remember that the Bible really does tell a story. It's a true story. It's the story of sin and salvation. That's putting it in a nutshell. That's the whole Bible, beginning to end. It's the story of sin and salvation. And so Genesis is the backstory that helps us understand the whole story. So what is that story? Well, you have outlines, you can read that. That kind of gives you a way to describe the content. But again, there's a better way, in my judgment, and that is to think of Genesis as a story that is beginning to unfold. So let's do it this way. I'm going to give you 4 P's that describe the message, the story of the book of Genesis. 4 P's that describe the backstory of Genesis. Okay? First P, purpose. Now, we just spent weeks preaching on the creation, so I don't need to camp here. What we've seen time and time and time again is that God, the world, and us with a purpose. We preached a whole sermon on why God made man. We preached another whole sermon on why God made the world. He didn't have to do any of this, but he did. He did to express his love. He didn't make man because he needed somebody to love. We talked about this when I preached that sermon. God exists in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And there is perfect love between the members of the Trinity, the persons of the Trinity. So God doesn't need us to love. but He made us to express His love and to as it were, plant His love in us. That's why whenever Jesus asks about the great commandments, the answer is what? The first and greatest commandment is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second commandment is like it, which is what? You shall love your neighbor. In other words, the whole law is summed up in one word, love. So God made us for a purpose. So Genesis begins with God's purpose. That's basically Genesis 1, but parts of 2 and other places in the book. So this is purpose. That's the first page. Second page, problem. Well, we preached on that too. We preached on the fall. I preached the whole sermon just on temptation. Preached a sermon on the consequences of the fall, what that did to the human race. So the problem is that sin enters the world. As Paul says in Romans chapter 5, by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin. I want to ask you to turn over, if you would, in Genesis to the 6th chapter. And let me show you something here. What we read in those first 6 chapters leading up to the flood is the beginnings, not the whole story, of course, but the beginnings, the backstory, so to speak, of the unfolding of sin, the problem of sin. Whenever I preached on the consequence of sin, one thing I pointed out was that it changed our physical makeup. So that in Genesis, you read about these incredibly long lives. The average age of these patriarchs in chapter 5 is 912 years. Methuselah lived to be 969 years. We come to Moses, and it's 175. We come, Moses, 120. Abraham is 175. So the ages are dropping, and then we get to Psalm 90, and we read that the span of life is 70. Today in America, it's about 79. So sin worked its work in our physical body so that longevity actually began to decrease over time. But notice also, this is in chapter 6 of Genesis. This is the prelude to the flood and God's judgment on the world. Now, it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the daughters were born to them. Then there's this description of the daughters of the sons of God and the daughters of men. We won't go into that. That's another whole dissertation. But what we read is that the world was becoming more and more and more wicked. So verse 8 says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thought of the heart was only evil continually." By the way, at the end of the flood, this is in chapter 8, at the end of the flood, God announces to Noah that He will never again destroy the earth this way, and the rainbow is the sign of that. But God adds to that promise this reminder. I'm not going to destroy the earth this way again, ever. But man, the heart of man, is only evil continually. So the heart of man didn't change. The flood didn't change the heart of man at all. Man was just as wicked after the flood as he was before the flood. And so the story continues, sin and salvation. So in the early chapters of Genesis, we have the beginnings of this outworking of the problem. We have the first murder. Cain murders Abel. We have Cain disobeying God. God says that you will be a fugitive and a on the earth. But Cain does exactly what human beings do. He shook his fist in the face of God and he says, "You say I'm going to be a vagabond on the face of the earth. I won't. I'll show you. I'm going to build a city." And he does. So Genesis tells the story of the problem, and that problem unfolds, and we see it more and more and more clearly as Genesis goes along. Thirdly, God makes a promise. that promise is first, and I emphasize first, that promise is first mentioned in chapter 3, immediately following the fall of the man and his wife. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, God pronounces the curse upon the serpent. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. By the way, one of my mentors in ministry was a man named Alton Nash. Alton Nash, he was a high school dropout. He went to a little Bible college in Florida and he said, I left after a year because I couldn't teach him anything. That's what he said. He was one remarkable man. He could think faster on his feet than anybody I've ever met. And he was a high school dropout. He was absolutely amazing. And I can still hear him say, he's with the Lord now, but I can still hear Alton say that, the Bible says that I'm supposed to hate a snake and love a serpent. I mean, hate a snake and love a woman. And I do. I hate snakes and I love my wife. Anyway, I don't know why you need to hear that. But at any rate, God pronounces the curse on the serpent, and there's this in-between between your seed and her seed. And then the promise at the end of verse 15. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. What scholars call the proto-evangelium, the first gospel. So this is the beginning of the promise, but the promise is unfolded all through the book of Genesis. So one of the ways that promise is unfolded is that Genesis follows the godly line from Adam. There is Abel, who is a godly man, Cain, who is not. And Cain kills Abel, so the godly line is wiped out, except that Eve has another son. His name is Seth. She says, because I've gotten a man from the Lord. The word Seth, the name Seth, means appointed. God appointed him to carry on the godly line. When godliness is almost extinguished on the earth, God looks down and sees Noah, and Noah finds favor in the sight of God, and God rescues Noah and his family so that the human race is not exterminated. God's promise continues with the line of descent. Abraham cannot have children. Abraham and Sarah can't have children. So they finagle their own heir. They arrange for Abraham to take Hagar, the Egyptian, and have a son. She does, Ishmael. But God says, no, I'm not chosen Ishmael. I'm choosing, I'm going to give a son to Sarah, and that will be the heir. And so God works so that Sarah can conceive, and she bears Isaac, and you know the rest of that story. And then there's Jacob and Esau, and God chooses Jacob and not Esau, just as he chose Isaac and not Ishmael, and so forth. So God, all through Genesis, is choosing the line of godly descent. That's how he's going to keep his promise. Remember, the promise to Abraham was in you, all in you. All the nations of the earth will be blessed. The promise of God is continued through that godly line that God chooses. So, there is purpose, there's problem, there's promise. What do you think the fourth key is? Let's turn to Genesis chapter 12. That passage we just read a few moments ago. Look at it again. Because this is going to be important for the way we're going to end our message today. But actually, I want you to look, not at the 12th chapter, just in the 11th chapter. In verse 27, you have one of those toledo occurrences. In the 27th verse of chapter 11. This is the genealogy. In Hebrew, it says, these are the toledot of. This is the generation, or these are the toledot. This is the history of Terah. Who is Terah? And why does he get special mention here? Well, Terah is not really the history here. This history that's about to unfold is not the history of Terah. In fact, Terah is only mentioned briefly and he disappears. What's the concern here? The concern is not with Terah. Abraham. This is the story, this is the history of Abraham, who happens to be descended from Terah, who is apparently a pagan. And so that brings us to chapter 12. Now the Lord God said to Abram, at this point his name hadn't been changed, it's still Abram at this point, not Abraham. So the Lord God had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your kindred. Well, his country was Ur of the Chaldees. If you look at it on a map, it's way down in the south of what is today Iraq. In Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. So Abraham is called by God. How this happened exactly, we're not told, but Abraham is commanded by God, leave your father's house and your country. In other words, leave your comfort zone, everything that you've known, and go where? To a place that I will show you. In other words, you've got to trust me. You'll have to trust me to lead you where I want you to go. Okay? So, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. And then God makes him a promise. It's an incredible promise. It's sometimes called the Abrahamic covenant. The promise, the pledge that God makes to Abraham. And the promise is this: I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. Notice, there are two sides to this. I will make your name great. I will bless you, but I will bless you to make you a blessing. We sometimes say that about the Christian life. God blesses us to make us a blessing. Well, that has a long history. It goes back to Abraham. God says to Abraham specifically, I'm going to bless you with a huge progeny, with a whole people, a whole nation, a multitude of people. But I'm doing that not for your sake, but that you might be a blessing. And then the crucial verse, verse 3, one of the great verses of the Bible. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And here we are. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So the four P's. Purpose: God made the world and all of us for a purpose. Problem: sin enters the world and spoils everything. Sin messes up everything. Nothing is the way it's supposed to be. But God, in his mercy and grace, makes a promise. And listen to this, church. God always keeps his promises. But in Genesis, we're told this, that he keeps his promise to a people. That's the fourth P. Purpose, problem, promise, people. The people, of course, are the Jewish people. Now, as I pointed out to the class when we were studying Exodus, at this point, the people is just a family. It's just Abraham's family. It's just the clan of Abraham, which grows. It gets big. It gets really big by the end of Genesis. So that when we come to Exodus, it's probably numbering 2 or 3 million. But that takes a lot of time. That takes 4 or 5 centuries. So when God makes the promise to Abraham, it's just Abraham. And remember, Abraham's wife, Sarah, can't have children. We don't know if the problem was Abraham or Sarah. I think, based on something in Hebrews, it was probably Abraham's problem. Well, we don't know. But at any rate, they couldn't have children. They tried to arrange things the way, we try to fake salvation. People try to fake salvation. So, or we try to keep God's promise to us instead of letting him do it. So Abraham tried to do that with Hagar. And God says, no, I haven't chosen Ishmael. That's your doing. That's your ball game. I'm going to give Sarah a child, and that will be the heir. Notice this promise. God has promised Abraham a mighty nation. And if Sarah can't have a child, if Abraham and Sarah can't have a natural child, this promise falls flat on the earth. But God never fails to keep his promise. So God promises Abraham that you will be a mighty nation, and he performs miracle after miracle to keep his promise until ultimately this family becomes a mighty clan, and the clan in Exodus will become the people of God that we know as Israel, through whom God will send his Messiah, Jesus of the house of David. Well, I've told you, my time is gone, I've told you in the midweek memo that every week in our journey through the Bible, I'm going to try to give you an outline. I've done that. I've tried to give you a theme verse, a critical theme verse, and a little background for the book, but also I want to give you a little takeaway. Well, I don't have time for all the takeaways of Genesis. There are too many. But I want to leave you with one. I want you to latch on to this. The whole story of Genesis depends on, listen, the whole story of Genesis depends on the grace of God. When Adam sins, God could have allowed him just to bear the consequences of his sin. Because he told him, didn't he tell him? In the day that you eat of the fruit, in that day, you die. If God had allowed Adam just to reap the bitter fruit of disobeying God, God would have been perfectly just. No. God, in grace, says, no, I'm not going to leave it there. I'm not going to leave you in your sin. The seed of the woman will bruise the head of the serpent. You will bruise his heel, and he will crush your head. God promises all by grace. If we follow God's plan, that as it unfolds through the book of Genesis, we'll see that time and time again, it's the grace of God. When the whole earth has become wicked, God looks down and says, I'm going to save Noah, because that's the only way to save the human race. It's all the grace of God. I want to tell you a little story, and I know this is a little risky because it's personal. I'm a foster child. I was raised in a foster home. I never really knew my birth parents. I have a memory of a terrible night, a lot of screaming and arguing. And I found out eventually, when I found my dad before he died, my birth father, that that was the night my mother left the family. My brother and I were deserted by our mother, and our father contracted TB and could no longer take care of us, and so the state took us away and put us in a county home, Fulton County, Georgia. I remember the home. I remember it. I was old enough to remember it. And I can remember a whole bunch of other things. I'm not going to tell you all the sort of details. But one day, and it happened to be, I know this, the day after my 5th birthday, so it was October 26th, I found myself in a new home. My mom and dad told me that apparently I had never seen a light switch. So I went through the house turning on the lights. Never seen one. I'd always seen just bulbs hanging from the ceiling. That's all I'd ever seen. A couple, in those days, too old to adopt in the state of Georgia. This couple, Arp and Willie Lane Kerr, he's just a farmer, took in 2 little boys. You know what? I thought about this all the way up to today. I thought, you know what? Mom and Dad never told me why. Except that they just wanted children and couldn't adopt. But why us? Why us? I have no idea. I have no idea why. All I know is this: that by grace, had nothing to do with me. That by grace, this older couple reached into that juvenile home and took out two little boys and gave them a life. That is the grace of God. For by grace are you saved. The same grace that made a promise when God didn't need to make a promise. The same grace that reached down into southern Mesopotamia and said, Abraham, I want you to leave your country. I'm going to make you a great nation. And I'm going to bless the whole world through you. For by grace are you saved. It's not of yourselves. Let's stand together, shall we?